Do you believe people are naturally good? That deep down, beneath the layers of selfishness and mistakes, there's an innate virtue guiding us? If you do, you're not alone. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? But what if I told you this idea is a lie, a myth we cling to because the truth is too uncomfortable? And what if I told you that Voltaire, the razor-sharp philosopher of the Enlightenment, didn't just reject this myth, he obliterated it? Voltaire believed in reason, progress, and human potential, yes. But he was also deeply skeptical of humanity's supposed innate goodness. While many of his contemporaries, like Rousseau, painted humanity as virtuous and pure, corrupted only by society, Voltaire saw things differently. His vision was darker, sharper, more grounded in the messy reality of human nature. And it's this hidden vision, this uncomfortable, undeniable insight, that shattered the myth of human virtue. You might not want to hear it, but Voltaire's view wasn't just a critique of his time, it's a critique of ours too. Because if we're honest, we're still clinging to this myth of virtue, telling ourselves that people are inherently good. But are we? Or are we something else entirely? The idea that humans are naturally virtuous, born pure, good, and untainted, is one of the most comforting lies we've ever told ourselves. It's a myth that's been whispered through the ages, passed down in stories, traditions, and philosophies. What? Because it feels good. It's easier to believe that virtue is our default state, that we only go astray because of external forces, society, culture, bad luck, than to confront the more unsettling truth. Perhaps at our core we are not as virtuous as we'd like to think. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered why we love tales of innocence corrupted? Think about it, the noble savage, the innocent child, the perfect utopia destroyed by greed or malice. These narratives tell us that the world is to blame, not us. They absolve us of responsibility. If only we could return to that pure state, they suggest, everything would be fine. But Voltaire saw through this comforting fantasy. He looked at human history, its wars, its injustices, its betrayals, and asked, if virtue is our natural state, where's the evidence? Voltaire's critique wasn't just a philosophical exercise, it was a direct attack on one of the Enlightenment's most cherished ideas. His contemporaries, especially Rousseau, clung to the belief that humans were born good, that society was the corrupting force. Rousseau painted a picture of a world where, left to our own devices, we would live in harmony with nature, guided by an innate sense of virtue. It was a beautiful, hopeful vision. And Voltaire destroyed it. In his satirical masterpiece Candide, Voltaire skewers the idea of inherent goodness with brutal precision. The protagonist, Candide, starts his journey as a naive believer in the philosophy that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. But as he encounters war, betrayal, greed, and suffering, that belief is repeatedly shattered. Voltaire doesn't just critique blind optimism. He exposes the absurdity of believing that human nature is inherently noble or that virtue can exist without effort, reflection, and discipline. Take a moment to think about your own life. How often have you assumed the best intentions in others, only to be disappointed? How many times have you witnessed selfishness, dishonesty, or cruelty, even from people you trusted? These aren't exceptions, they're patterns. And yet, we cling to the myth of virtue because the alternative feels too bleak. If humans aren't naturally good, what does that say about us? About the world we've built? About the future? But Voltaire wasn't cynical. He didn't believe humanity was doomed or incapable of progress. What he rejected was the idea that progress could come from pretending we're something we're not. For Voltaire, real improvement begins with honesty, with looking at ourselves as we truly are, not as we wish to be. And that means acknowledging the darker sides of human nature, our capacity for greed, our tendency toward tribalism, our relentless pursuit of power. Here's the paradox. By admitting we're not inherently virtuous, we actually create the possibility for real virtue. When we stop pretending that goodness is our default state, we can start doing the hard work of becoming better. And that's the heart of Voltaire's vision. He didn't destroy the myth of human virtue to leave us in despair. He destroyed it to free us, to show us that virtue isn't something we're born with, it's something we build through effort, reflection, and action. Let's dig a little deeper into why this myth is so seductive. From a psychological perspective, the belief in innate virtue is a defense mechanism. It protects us from the discomfort of self-awareness. If I believe I'm naturally good, then I don't have to question my actions, my motives, or my beliefs. I don't have to confront the possibility that I'm capable of selfishness, laziness, or cruelty. The myth shields us from the hard work of self-examination. But that shield also limits us. It keeps us stuck in a state of complacency, unable to grow or change. This is why Voltaire's critique is so powerful and so uncomfortable. He forces us to confront the gap between who we are and who we think we are. He challenges us to question the stories we tell ourselves about our own goodness. And in doing so, he opens the door to something far more meaningful than the comforting lie of innate virtue, the possibility of earned virtue. Let me leave you with this thought. If virtue isn't something we're born with, then every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every choice to do what's right despite the cost, becomes an act of creation. It becomes a testament to our ability to rise above our nature, to shape ourselves into something better. And isn't that far more inspiring than the idea that virtue is something we just happen to have? Voltaire's vision destroyed the myth of human virtue, but in its place, he left us with something far more profound: the freedom to become truly virtuous. If Voltaire was the Enlightenment's sharp-tongued realist, Rousseau was its dreamer, its romantic idealist. Their clash wasn't just intellectual, it was a collision of worldviews. Voltaire, with his biting wit and unrelenting skepticism, stood firmly against Rousseau's glowing vision of humanity's innate goodness. And the stakes of this philosophical feud were higher than they might first appear. At its heart, their debate was about the very essence of human nature and what it meant for the future of society. Rousseau painted a picture of humanity as noble and pure, corrupted only by the chains of civilization. His belief in the noble savage suggested that in a state of nature, untouched by the rules and pressures of modern life, humans would live harmoniously, guided by their inherent virtue. For Rousseau, it wasn't humanity that was flawed, it was the systems we'd built. Laws, hierarchies, institutions, these were the real culprits. Strip them away, he argued, and we'd rediscover our natural goodness. It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? The notion that the world's problems aren't our fault, but the fault of something external, something we can dismantle, fix, or escape from. It's an idea that resonates even today in movements that romanticize simpler times, advocate for minimalism, or seek refuge in nature as a cure for the ills of modern life. Rousseau offered hope, the kind that says we are good, we just need to find our way back to it. But Voltaire wasn't buying it. He saw Rousseau's vision as naive at best, dangerous at worst. In one of his famously sarcastic letters to Rousseau, Voltaire wrote, "I have received your new book against the human race. One longs, in reading your work, to walk on all fours." He mocked the romanticism of returning to a natural state, arguing that civilization, for all its flaws, was what elevated humanity. It wasn't the cause of our problems, it was the imperfect attempt to solve them. To Voltaire, Rousseau's idealism was a denial of reality. History wasn't filled with examples of noble savages living in peace. It was a record of violence, greed, and conquest. Even in the so-called natural state, humans weren't saints. They were driven by survival, self-interest, and the same flaws that plagued them in civilization. For Voltaire, progress wasn't about returning to some mythical past. It was about confronting humanity's flaws head-on and working to improve them. But let's pause for a moment. Why is Rousseau's vision so appealing? Why do we want to believe that society is the problem and that deep down, we're good? Because it absolves us of responsibility. If the fault lies in the system, then we don't have to confront the uncomfortable truth that the system is a reflection of us. We built it. We perpetuate it. And if it's flawed, it's because we're flawed. Voltaire's critique forces us to confront that truth, and it's not an easy pill to swallow. Here's an example. Think about the laws and rules that govern our lives. They exist to maintain order, to protect people from harm, to ensure fairness, or at least that's the ideal. But why do we need them in the first place? Because without them, human nature often veers toward chaos. Greed, jealousy, fear, these are not products of society. They're part of who we are. And while Rousseau might dream of a world where we don't need rules, Voltaire reminds us that such a world is a fantasy. Their debate wasn't just theoretical. It had real implications for how society should be organized. If Rousseau was right, then the solution to humanity's problems was to tear down the systems that constrained us and return to a simpler way of life. But if Voltaire was right, then the solution was to build better systems. Systems that account for human flaws rather than pretending they don't exist. This clash between idealism and realism is as relevant today as it was in Voltaire's time. Think about how we approach issues like poverty, inequality, or environmental destruction. There are those who, like Rousseau, argue that the problem is the system and that we need to start over. And then there are those who, like Voltaire, argue that while the system is flawed, it's the best tool we have, and that the real challenge is improving it without falling into the trap of romanticizing the past. Voltaire's critique of Rousseau wasn't about crushing hope, it was about grounding it in reality. He understood that progress requires more than good intentions. It requires an honest assessment of where we are, who we are, and what we're capable of. And that means rejecting simplistic narratives about humanity's innate virtue and confronting the messy, complicated truth. But here's the thing, Voltaire didn't hate Rousseau. In fact, he recognized the value of Rousseau's idealism. It's important to dream of a better world, to imagine what could be. But Voltaire warned against letting those dreams blind us to reality. Because without a clear-eyed view of human nature, those dreams are doomed to fail. The war of ideas between Voltaire and Rousseau wasn't just about philosophy, it was about the future. Rousseau's vision inspired revolutions, movements, and ideologies that sought to reshape society. But Voltaire's vision, with its emphasis on reason, skepticism, and incremental progress, has endured as a reminder that change is hard, messy, and often imperfect. So whose side are you on? Do you believe, like Rousseau, that humans are naturally good and that we just need to escape the chains of civilization? Or do you side with Voltaire, who saw humanity as deeply flawed but capable of greatness through effort and reason? The answer isn't black and white, but the debate itself forces us to think critically about who we are and how we move forward. And maybe that's the point. Why do we cling so tightly to the myth of human virtue? Why is it so hard for us to accept Voltaire's vision, which cuts through the comforting narrative that people are inherently good? The answer lies not in philosophy but in psychology, deep within the human mind, where our need to believe in our own goodness meets our extraordinary capacity for self-deception. This isn't just a philosophical question, it's a mirror held up to our collective psyche. And when we look into that mirror, what we see is often more myth than reality. Let's start with the obvious. Admitting that we're not naturally virtuous is deeply uncomfortable. It forces us to confront our flaws, our failures, and our darkest impulses. And let's be honest, no one likes to do that. So we create stories. Stories that paint us as heroes, as victims, as noble beings corrupted by external forces. These stories protect us from the weight of responsibility, from the uncomfortable truth that our actions are often driven by self-interest, fear, or insecurity. Think about it. How often do we rationalize our behavior to make ourselves look better in our own eyes? When you snap at someone, do you blame your own impatience or do you justify it by saying they deserved it? When you procrastinate, do you admit you're avoiding discomfort or do you tell yourself you're just waiting for the right moment? These little acts of self-deception pile up, reinforcing the myth of our own virtue and shielding us from the harder work of self-reflection. This isn't just an individual phenomenon, it's a collective one. Societies, cultures, and even entire nations build myths of virtue to justify their actions. Wars are fought in the name of justice. Exploitation is excused as progress. History is rewritten to paint the aggressors as saviors. Voltaire understood this all too well. He saw how people and institutions weaponized the myth of virtue to avoid accountability, to justify atrocities, and to maintain power. But here's where it gets even more insidious. The myth of virtue isn't just a lie we tell others, it's a lie we tell ourselves. And it's a lie we desperately want to believe. Why? Because it gives us hope. It allows us to see ourselves and others in a positive light, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Without that hope, the world feels bleak, chaotic, and unmanageable. Psychologists call this phenomenon cognitive dissonance, the discomfort we feel when our actions don't align with our beliefs. If we believe we're good people but we act in ways that contradict that belief, the dissonance is unbearable. So we resolve it by changing the narrative. Instead of admitting, "I acted selfishly," we tell ourselves, "I had no choice." Instead of acknowledging, "I hurt someone out of anger," we say, "They pushed me to it." These mental gymnastics protect our self-image, but they also prevent us from growing. Voltaire, ever the skeptic, didn't let humanity off the hook so easily. He saw through these justifications and exposed them for what they were: excuses. In his works, he held a mirror up to society, showing us our hypocrisy, our contradictions, and our capacity for self-delusion. In Candide, he lampoons the idea that everything happens for the best, exposing how people cling to optimism even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Through satire, Voltaire forces us to confront the gap between who we think we are and who we really are. But let's not mistake Voltaire's critique for cynicism. He wasn't saying we're irredeemable, far from it. He believed in humanity's potential for progress, but he understood that progress begins with honesty. You can't fix a problem you refuse to acknowledge. And you can't become better if you're unwilling to confront your flaws. Let's talk about fear for a moment. Fear is one of the biggest drivers of self-deception. We're afraid of failure, of rejection, of being seen as flawed. And so, we build walls around ourselves, walls of excuses, justifications, and blame. These walls keep us safe from the harsh light of self-awareness, but they also trap us. They prevent us from seeing the truth about ourselves and others. And without that truth, real change is impossible. Here's an example. Imagine you're in a disagreement with someone. Your immediate reaction is to defend yourself, to explain why you're right and they're wrong. But why? Is it really about the issue at hand, or is it about protecting your self-image? Often, our need to be right isn't about truth, it's about ego. It's about maintaining the illusion of our own virtue, even at the expense of connection, understanding, or growth. Now, let's take this idea and apply it on a larger scale. How many societal problems persist because we refuse to confront uncomfortable truths? Inequality, corruption, environmental destruction. These issues are often framed as external problems, things that happen out there. But Voltaire would argue that they're reflections of human nature, amplified by systems and structures that enable our worst tendencies. The myth of virtue allows us to shift the blame, to point fingers at society, government, or history instead of looking in the mirror. But here's the good news. Once we see through the myth, we gain the power to change. Self-deception might protect us from discomfort, but it also limits us. When we acknowledge our flaws, we create space for growth. When we confront our capacity for selfishness, we open the door to greater empathy. And when we let go of the need to be perfect, we can start the real work of becoming better. Voltaire's vision wasn't about despair, it was about liberation. By destroying the myth of innate virtue, he freed us from the burden of pretending to be something we're not. He showed us that goodness isn't a given, it's a choice. And that choice, while difficult, is also empowering. Because when we take responsibility for our actions, our beliefs, and our impact, we reclaim our agency. We stop being passive participants in the story of humanity and start shaping it. So, let me ask you, what stories are you telling yourself? What myths are you clinging to, and what truths are you avoiding? The answers might be uncomfortable, but they're also the key to your growth. Voltaire understood that the first step to becoming better isn't believing you're good, it's admitting you're not. And in that admission, there's a kind of freedom. A freedom to stop pretending, to start questioning, and to finally, truly grow. If human virtue is a myth, as Voltaire so provocatively argued, then what are we left with? Are we doomed to cynicism, to a world without goodness or hope? Or is there something even more profound waiting for us once we let go of the comforting lie? For Voltaire, the destruction of the myth of innate virtue wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A beginning rooted not in despair, but in empowerment. He wasn't tearing humanity down to leave it in ruins. He was clearing the ground so we could build something stronger, more enduring, and more real. Let's start with this. Virtue isn't something we're born with. It's something we cultivate. It's not a default state. It's a choice, a discipline, a practice. Voltaire understood this deeply, and he wove it into his most famous works. Take Candide, for instance. After all the absurdities, tragedies, and disillusionments, what's the final message? We must cultivate our garden. It's such a simple line, but it holds a universe of meaning. It's a call to action, not to dream of utopias, not to lament the flaws of the world, but to engage with it, to work with what we have, and to make it better. But what does it mean to cultivate our garden? It means taking responsibility. For ourselves, for our actions, for the small corner of the world we inhabit. It means acknowledging that virtue isn't about grand ideals, it's about the choices we make every day. It's about how we treat the people around us, how we respond to challenges, how we navigate the complexities of life. Virtue isn't about perfection, it's about effort. And that effort, while imperfect, is what makes it meaningful. Think about the world we live in today. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by its problems: climate change, inequality, political polarization. These challenges are massive, systemic, and often feel beyond our control. But Voltaire's message is clear: start where you are. You don't need to solve everything. You don't need to be a hero. You just need to take responsibility for your garden, for the things you can touch, influence, and improve. Virtue doesn't happen on a global scale. It happens in the small, everyday acts of kindness, courage, and integrity. Here's where psychology comes in. Research shows that people who focus on what they can control, rather than what they can't, tend to be happier, more resilient, and more effective. This isn't just about individual well-being, it's about collective progress. When we each take responsibility for our own garden, those small efforts add up. They create ripples that spread outward, influencing others, inspiring change, and building momentum. The myth of virtue might be comforting, but the practice of virtue is transformative. But let's not sugarcoat it. Cultivating virtue is hard. It requires self-awareness, discipline, and a willingness to face discomfort. It means confronting your biases, admitting your mistakes, and taking accountability for your impact. It's not glamorous, it's not easy, but it's real. And that's what makes it powerful. Let's return to Voltaire's critique of Rousseau. While Rousseau dreamed of a world where virtue was natural, Voltaire argued that virtue is something we have to work for. And this work isn't about escaping society or rejecting civilization. It's about engaging with it thoughtfully and critically. It's about building systems, structures, and cultures that encourage and reward virtue, rather than pretending it will happen on its own. Consider the idea of justice. Justice isn't natural. It's a human invention, a collective effort to create fairness in an inherently unfair world. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And like virtue, it requires constant effort to maintain and improve. Voltaire's vision reminds us that progress isn't about finding perfection. It's about striving for better, even when better feels incremental and imperfect. Here's another layer to Voltaire's wisdom. He understood the power of skepticism. Skepticism isn't about rejecting everything. It's about questioning, challenging, and thinking critically. It's about refusing to accept easy answers, whether they come from religion, politics, or philosophy. Skepticism isn't the enemy of virtue, it's its ally. Because when we question the myths we've been told, we create space for new possibilities, new ideas, and new ways of being. And yet, Voltaire didn't stop at skepticism. He paired it with a profound belief in human potential. He believed we could rise above our flaws, not by pretending they don't exist, but by confronting them honestly. This is where his vision becomes truly revolutionary. He wasn't interested in utopias or ideals. He was interested in what's possible here and now in the messy reality of human life. And that's why his message still resonates today. So, what does this mean for us? It means we need to let go of the idea that virtue is something we're entitled to. It's not. It's something we earn through effort, reflection, and action. It means embracing the messiness of being human, the contradictions, the flaws, the failures, and using them as a starting point for growth. It means recognizing that progress doesn't come from grand gestures or sweeping revolutions. It comes from small, deliberate acts of goodness repeated over time. Let me ask you, what's your garden? What are the things in your life that you can touch, influence, and improve? Maybe it's your relationships, your work, your community. Maybe it's the way you treat yourself, the way you show up for others, the way you navigate challenges. Whatever it is, that's where your virtue begins. Not in abstract ideals, but in the concrete, messy, imperfect reality of your life. Voltaire destroyed the myth of innate virtue, but he left us with something far more valuable: the freedom to create virtue for ourselves. It's not easy, it's not guaranteed, but it's real. And in a world filled with myths and illusions, that reality is something worth striving for. So start where you are. Cultivate your garden. And in doing so, you might just discover that the path to virtue isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, being responsible, and being willing to grow.